In the summer of 1958, a photographer set out on a routine job in the heart of Texas. What he captured on film would change everything. A town, one that never officially existed, would be revealed to the world not by government records or historical accounts, but by a single photograph. Its fate hidden for decades. Texas, 1958, the year the world saw the dawn of the space age. Yet in one remote corner of the state, a mystery was quietly brewing. A small town appeared on a photograph that seemed to defy all logic. How could this town exist? Why wasn't it on any map? Who were the people that lived there, and why was it erased from history? The town's name, Orellano, was a name few had ever heard of, and fewer still could recognize. It wasn't listed in any historical records. No one could find it on any map. It was as if it had been erased from every document, from every spoken word. And yet, there it was, a snapshot in time, captured by the lens of a man who had no idea of the storm he was about to unleash. The photographer, a man by the name of Paul Whitaker, had been hired by the local government to take photos of the landscape for an agricultural project. His task seemed simple enough: capture images of the plains and deserts that spread across West Texas. But as Paul traveled further into the desolate stretch of land, something caught his eye. In the distance, he saw it, a town with houses and buildings, quiet but unmistakably there. Paul stopped his truck on the dirt road and grabbed his camera. The sight before him was odd, almost out of place. Dusty roads wound through rows of old wooden houses, and a few people moved about in the streets. Their presence seemed unremarkable at first glance, just the kind of small-town Americana that could be found all across the country. But as Paul took the photograph, something gnawed at him. There was an air of finality to the place, a sense that the town had been forgotten. Was it real? Was it a mirage? Paul's curiosity got the better of him, and he took several more photographs from different angles. His intuition told him there was something important about this place. As he snapped the last photo, he felt the weight of an eerie silence settle over him. The wind barely moved, and the usual sounds of the Texas plains, chirping insects, rustling bushes, the distant call of birds, seemed to have disappeared. When Paul returned to his base, he processed the film as usual. The results shocked him. The photographs revealed something he hadn't anticipated, something he couldn't explain. Among the dusty roads and wooden homes, he had captured not just an ordinary town, but a ghost town, one that wasn't supposed to exist. The town of Orellano had no place in history. There were no records of it, no mention in any government archives, no sign of it on any official map. The more Paul thought about it, the more unsettled he became. It didn't make sense. Where had this town come from? Who had lived there? Why had it been hidden for so long? For months, the photograph sat on Paul's desk, untouched and unexplored. It wasn't until he shared it with a colleague, another photographer named Linda Carter, that things began to take a strange turn. Linda had spent her life studying small towns, local histories, and the geography of Texas. When she saw the photograph, her reaction was immediate and chilling. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice trembling with an emotion Paul couldn't place. She stared at the photo as if it were a puzzle she couldn't solve, the pieces slipping just out of her grasp. "It's out in the plains, about 30 miles northeast of here," Paul replied. still unsure of the significance of what he had discovered. Linda shook her head. There's nothing there. Nothing has been there for years. This photo doesn't make sense. The more they spoke, the more the mystery deepened. Linda, who knew the area well, couldn't recall any town named Orellano, nor could she find any trace of it in her own research. The more they dug, the less they found. And yet, the photograph remained, a stark reminder that sometimes things aren't what they seem. Over the next few weeks, Paul and Linda sought out every possible source they could think of. They scoured old maps, dug through archives, and contacted local historians. There was no mention of Orellano anywhere. It was as though it had been erased from the collective memory of Texas itself. Some speculated that the town had been abandoned long ago, left to decay under the harsh conditions of the desert. But even if it had been abandoned, how could such a place have been completely erased from history? Soon, word of the photograph spread. Other photographers and historians took an interest in Orellano, but their research only seemed to lead to more questions. Theories began to emerge. Was it a forgotten military base, a secret government project? Or was it simply a town that had been lost to time, hidden away by an unknown force? Theories flew fast and wild, but no one could provide any real answers. The truth about Orellano, if there even was one, remained elusive. As the mystery of the photograph deepened, something strange began to happen. People who had lived in nearby towns, people who had heard rumors of Orellano, started coming forward with their own stories. Some claimed to have known people who had lived there. Others spoke of strange disappearances, events that had been glossed over or forgotten by the public. One elderly woman, now in her 80s, claimed that she had once visited Orellano as a child, but when she returned to tell others about it, no one believed her. There was a dark, hidden history in the town, they said, a history no one wanted to revisit. The more people spoke about Orellano, the more it became clear that there were two sides to this mystery. On one side, there were those who believed it was a town that had simply faded into obscurity. On the other, there were whispers of something more sinister, something more deliberate. One evening, as Paul sat in his small office, staring at the photograph once again, he heard a knock on the door. It was Linda, looking pale and anxious. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low. "I found something." Linda entered Paul's office, her steps hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether she wanted to share what she had uncovered. She held a few papers in her hand, crumpled slightly, as if they'd been through many hands before hers. Paul could see the unease in her eyes. Something had shaken her. "What did you find?" Paul asked, his voice barely a whisper. He could tell from her posture that whatever it wasn't good news. Linda took a deep breath and laid the papers on the desk. "I've been going through the old records from Rio Blanco. It's not much, but there's one document that stood out." She slid the papers closer to him. Paul scanned them quickly. They were pages from an old ledger, a typed written document with uneven, fading ink. The heading read, "Municipal Records, Rio Blanco, 1931. At the top of the page in bold letters was a name, Orellano, Relocation and Erasure. Paul froze. "Relocation and erasure?" he murmured. "What does that mean?" Linda's fingers trembled as she pointed to a small section in the middle of the page. This was part of a military operation, apparently. The U.S. government had planned to establish a training ground for experimental weapons in this area. Orellano was a casualty of that plan. The town was relocated, and any trace of it was erased. People were told to leave, and any buildings that couldn't be moved were destroyed. The more Paul read, The more the document seemed like something out of a conspiracy theorist dream. It suggested that Orellano had been intentionally wiped from history. There were no official records, no press releases, nothing to indicate that the town had ever existed. In fact, the only mention of Orellano in official archives had been erased in the 1930s, right after the relocation. The government had done its best to bury any trace of the town, and for decades they had succeeded. But what about the photograph? How could Paul's snapshot from 1958 show a town that should no longer exist? Had Orellano truly been forgotten, or was there something more going on, something much darker? This doesn't add up, Paul whispered, staring at the document in disbelief. If the government relocated them, why weren't the people registered? Why didn't anyone talk about it? Linda's eyes met his, a mix of fear and determination in her gaze. Because Orellano was never meant to be remembered. The people who lived there, they were the lucky ones, the ones who left. But the town itself, it was erased. Every trace of it was supposed to vanish. As the hours passed, Paul and Linda dug deeper. They visited archives, interviewed locals who had lived near Rio Blanco, and even reached out to military veterans who had served in the area during the 1930s. But all their efforts seemed to lead to the same dead end. Nobody remembered Orellano, at least not in any official capacity. The town had been forgotten, intentionally. And yet, there it was, captured in a photograph, still standing, seemingly untouched by time. The more they uncovered, the more questions piled up. But one thing began to emerge from the confusion. Orellano had been built for a reason, and that reason had never been explained. The government, after all, had a vested interest in erasing it, but the question lingered. Why? Then came a breakthrough. A former soldier named Ralph Simmons, now in his late 70s, reached out to them. He had served in the area during the early 1940s and had vague memories of a town near the site of Orellano. His recollection, though blurred by time, painted a picture of something strange, a place that shouldn't have been there, a place that had been shrouded in secrecy. "I remember being sent out there on a special mission," Ralph recalled, his voice low and gravelly. "We were told to keep our distance, to stay away from the town, but there was something odd about it. The people, they weren't like other folks. They acted like they were being watched." "What do you mean?" Paul asked, leaning forward, his heart racing with anticipation. "I don't know. It's hard to explain. They didn't act like normal people. Like they were just going through the motions, you know? I saw a couple of kids in the street, but their eyes, it was like they weren't really seeing anything." Paul felt a chill creep down his spine as Ralph spoke. The soldier's description matched something he'd seen in the photograph. The same vacant expressions on the people's faces, the strange stillness that seemed to hang in the air. Was this just a coincidence, or was something else at play? But the most unsettling part of Ralph's testimony came at the end of the conversation. "I never saw the place again," he said quietly. "But after that mission, I was told never to talk about it. No one was supposed to know about Orellano. It was like it never existed." It was clear now. Orellano had been more than just a forgotten town. It had been part of something far bigger, something the government had worked tirelessly to conceal. But why? What had really happened in Orellano that needed to be erased? The investigation was beginning to take on an entirely new dimension, one that was darker than Paul could have ever imagined. As Linda and Paul continued their research, they came across more and more references to Project Orellano, a code name for what was believed to be a covert experiment conducted during the early 1930s. But what that experiment had been remained a mystery. Some believed it involved psychological testing. Others claimed it was related to military technologies. But all the records pointed to one undeniable truth. Orellano was not just a town. It was a place of experimentation, and its inhabitants had paid the price for it. As the weight of the investigation pressed down on them, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of uncovering something far greater than a missing town. They weren't just trying to uncover history. They were on the trail of something that had been intentionally buried, something that had been erased from the world's collective memory. The question wasn't just about Orellano anymore. It was about the lengths to which the government had gone to hide the truth. And as the sun set on another day of research, Paul sat back in his chair, looking at the photograph one last time. The eerie stillness of the town seemed to haunt him, and he wondered, was Orellano a town lost to time, or was it something more sinister? And if it was a secret, why had they gone to such lengths to hide it? The more Paul and Linda uncovered, the more the shadows of the past began to stretch toward the present. Orellano wasn't just a forgotten town. It was a puzzle, with pieces scattered across decades of silence and secrecy. As Paul sifted through old records and uncovered more pieces of the puzzle, one truth began to crystallize. Orellano had been a site for something more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. But what had it been? Why was this town erased from history? And who were the people that had lived there? And why did they never speak of it? The answers, as Paul was soon to discover, would only raise more questions. It wasn't until Paul's visit to the local library in Rio Blanco that a breakthrough came. The librarian, a woman named Mary, had lived in the area her entire life and had heard the odd rumors of Orellano, but like most of the town, she dismissed them as legends and gossip. But when Paul showed her the photograph, her demeanor shifted instantly. Her face drained of color, and she quietly pulled him aside. "You should leave it alone," she whispered, her eyes darting nervously. "The people who go looking for Orellano, they don't come back the same." Mary's warning only deepened the mystery. What was she really saying? Was there more to Orellano than just a military cover-up? Or was there something about the land itself that had a darker hold over it? Paul's questions swirled in his mind, but he couldn't stop now. Something was pulling him closer to the truth. Something was urging him to dig deeper. Linda, too, felt the pull, despite the mounting danger. As they continued their investigation, they stumbled upon a letter buried deep within the library's archives. It was dated 1933, right around the time Orellano was believed to have been relocated. It was from a man named Dr. Theodore Finch, a name Paul had never heard before. The letter was addressed to an unnamed government official and contained a chilling message. "We have successfully isolated the subject. Further tests will begin immediately. The town of Orellano is perfect for our experiment. The residents are eager to comply, and the isolation of the area ensures no outside interference. We will monitor them for as long as necessary to achieve the desired results." The letter was a smoking gun, a clear indication that something sinister had occurred in Orellano. What had started as a simple photograph had now led to an experiment, something far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The town hadn't just been erased from the map, it had been used as a testing ground, and the people who lived there had been unknowingly subjected to something far beyond their comprehension. But the question remained, what was the nature of these experiments? What had they been trying to achieve? In the weeks that followed, Paul and Linda scoured every source they could find, piecing together fragments of Dr. Finch's work. It became clear that Orellano was no ordinary town. It had been part of a top-secret government experiment. The people who lived there, according to the documents, were the unwitting subjects of a program designed to manipulate behavior, test psychological resilience, and study the limits of human endurance. And the government had hidden it all under the guise of a simple relocation. As Paul stared at the letter, A deep sense of dread crept over him. He had learned enough to know that the truth behind Orellano was far darker than he had ever anticipated. But as he and Linda dug deeper, they uncovered even more unsettling facts. The next breakthrough came from a man named Earl Thompson, a former military contractor who had worked with the government during the 1930s. Earl had been hired to oversee various projects in the desert, though he had never been told exactly what they were. As he explained, he had been part of a team that built makeshift structures in the area, designed to house people who had been relocated from small towns like Orellano. But he was never given a clear reason for why the towns had to be cleared out in the first place. "There were rumors," Earl recalled, his voice shaky. "They told us not to ask too many questions. But there were things we saw that I can't explain. The people in those towns, they were different. Almost like they were drugged. Their eyes were blank. They didn't speak much, and when they did, it was like they were just repeating what they were told. I've never seen anything like it." Earl's account added a new layer to the mystery. The townspeople weren't just being relocated. They were being manipulated, controlled, perhaps even changed in ways no one fully understood. But what had the government been testing? Was it mind control? Psychological conditioning? And who was behind it all? Linda and Paul knew they couldn't stop now. The deeper they dug, the more disturbing the revelations became. But the true purpose of Orellano, of the experiment, still eluded them. They needed more answers, more concrete evidence, but time was running out. The closer they got to the truth, the more they realized that some people, powerful people, didn't want it to be uncovered. And then one evening, Linda received a phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was muffled, and the man spoke quickly. His words almost rushed, as if he was afraid to be heard. "You don't know what you're dealing with. You need to stop looking into Orellano. You're digging into something that wasn't meant to be found. There are people who don't want you to know what happened there. Leave it alone before it's too late." The line went dead before Linda could respond, but the warning was clear. As the days passed, Linda and Paul found themselves increasingly isolated. People they had trusted began to distance themselves, and even the few sources they had left became more guarded. It was clear that someone, some group, was watching them. The investigation, once fueled by curiosity, now felt like a dangerous game. But the truth about Orellano still haunted them. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that the town's erasure wasn't a mistake. It had been deliberate. But why? What had happened to the people of Orellano? And who was behind the cover-up? The photograph from 1958, still sitting on Paul's desk, seemed to mock them. It was proof of a town that should have never existed, but had. Proof of an experiment that had been buried beneath layers of lies and secrecy. And now the truth was slipping through their fingers like sand through an hourglass. The mystery of Orellano had become something far more than a simple historical curiosity. It had become a fight for truth, a battle between those who wanted to keep the secrets buried and those who refused to let them remain hidden. And as Linda and Paul drew closer to the heart of the mystery, they realized one terrifying fact. The truth was far worse than anything they had ever imagined. As the investigation progressed, the silence around Orellano grew deafening. The deeper Paul and Linda dug, the more they realized they were not just uncovering a forgotten town, they were pulling at the threads of a conspiracy that ran deep within the veins of the government. It was no longer just about Orellano. It was about everything that had been hidden for decades, buried beneath layers of secrecy and deceit. And as they continued to search for answers, the stakes grew higher. For every lead they followed, a new door opened, one that led to a darker, more dangerous path. The closer they got, the more it seemed like the walls were closing in on them. It was a late afternoon when the breakthrough finally came, an anonymous tip. A man who had been watching their progress reached out, his voice low and cautious. "I have information on Orellano, but you need to meet me in person. You won't find the answers where you're looking. Come to the old highway near the outskirts of town. But be careful. There's more at stake than you realize." Paul and Linda exchanged uneasy glances. They had been on the receiving end of enough warnings, but this felt different. There was a finality to it, a sense of urgency that made their blood run cold. But they had come this far. They couldn't stop now. They drove through the outskirts of Rio Blanco, the sun setting behind them, casting long shadows across the empty landscape. The air was thick with tension, and the silence in the car was almost suffocating. As they approached the spot where the man had instructed them to meet, they saw him, standing alone on the side of the road, his figure barely visible in the dimming light. The man was older, with a weathered face and a steady gaze that seemed to pierce through the darkness. He stepped toward their car, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. He didn't speak immediately, as if checking to see if anyone was watching. "Are you the ones investigating Orellano?" he asked, his voice hushed. Linda nodded. "We've been digging for months. What do you know about it?" The man hesitated for a moment before answering. "I was there. I worked with Dr. Finch's team. I was part of the operation." The revelation hit them like a punch to the gut. Dr. Finch, the name that had haunted their investigation, was no longer just a distant figure in the shadows. He was real. And he had left a trail of destruction that reached far beyond Orellano. The man continued, his voice trembling slightly as if the weight of the truth was too much to bear. "We weren't just testing behaviors. We weren't just running experiments. Orellano wasn't a town. It was a controlled environment, a lab. The residents were selected, yes, but not for their location. They were chosen for their vulnerability." "Vulnerability?" Paul repeated, his mind racing. "What do you mean?" The man took a deep breath, looking around nervously before continuing. "Orellano was built on top of an old Native American burial ground. But that's not what made it special. The real reason the government chose that land was because of the underground mineral deposits. There was something in the soil, something that affected the human brain. It amplified certain psychological traits. We used it to manipulate people." The air around Paul and Linda seemed to freeze. Every word that the man spoke only deepened the mystery, but it also raised an entirely new set of questions. They had believed that the government had erased Orellano to cover up a simple experiment, but now it seemed like there was something far more sinister at play, something that involved the land itself. The man's next words would haunt them for the rest of their lives. "We used the residents to test mind control, psychological conditioning. We wanted to see how far we could push the limits of human endurance and control, all under the guise of relocation. The people were told they were being moved for their safety. But they weren't. They were part of an experiment." Paul couldn't speak. He could barely comprehend what he was hearing. Orellano hadn't just been erased from history because it was a small town. It had been wiped away because the government had done something far more dangerous there. They had played with human minds, testing the boundaries of control, leaving behind nothing but fear and silence. Linda's voice broke the silence. How many people were involved? How many towns were affected? The man shook his head. I don't know. The records were destroyed, but I can tell you this. Orellano wasn't the only place. It wasn't even the only experiment. As the man spoke, the full extent of the government's operations began to sink in. Orellano had been one of many, a small part of a much larger experiment that involved manipulating the human psyche using unknown forces. The people of Orellano had been chosen because they were vulnerable, and the government had taken full advantage of that. They had used the land's strange properties to test the limits of control, without any regard for the damage they were causing. What happened to the people? Linda asked, her voice shaking. What did you do to them? The man's face darkened. We didn't do anything. The land, it did something to them. It changed them. After the relocation, the government covered it up. They destroyed any trace of the town, but the people, they were never the same. As the man finished speaking, he took a long look at Linda and Paul. His face, once filled with guilt, now seemed to carry a sense of finality. He turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the shadows of the evening. What happens now? Paul asked, his voice barely audible, but the man didn't respond. He had said everything he could say. The next day, as Paul and Linda went over their findings, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The government's hand was still there, just out of reach, manipulating the strings from the shadows. They had uncovered the truth, but at what cost? Was Orellano just a part of something bigger? A chain of events that stretched far beyond their understanding. One thing was certain. The mystery of Orellano was far from over. And as the investigation continued, the lines between history and conspiracy blurred beyond recognition. The revelations about Orellano had cracked open a door that had long been sealed shut. What had begun as a simple investigation into a forgotten town had become a descent into a labyrinth of government secrets, psychological experimentation, and dark conspiracies. Paul and Linda had only scratched the surface, but already they could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on them. Every step forward seemed to lead them deeper into the unknown, but there was no turning back now. They had uncovered something that couldn't be ignored, something that had been buried for decades. The question was no longer whether Orellano was a forgotten town. It was whether the people who controlled its secrets would allow anyone to bring it to light. It was 3 days after their meeting with the anonymous source when things took a dangerous turn. Paul and Linda had been working tirelessly, cross-referencing records, analyzing old government reports, and interviewing anyone who might know something. But the more they uncovered, the more they felt eyes on them. Eyes that didn't want them to find the truth. Linda had been the first to notice it. She had been walking to the car late one evening when she saw a black sedan parked across the street. It had been there for hours, the driver's face hidden behind darkened windows. She thought nothing of it at first, until the car had followed her on several occasions. The feeling of being watched had become too much to ignore. The next day, Paul received a cryptic phone call. The voice on the other end was calm, almost rehearsed, as if it had been practiced. You're getting too close to something you don't understand. You should stop digging. There are things about Orellano that you're not prepared to handle. If you keep going, we can't guarantee your safety. Paul didn't respond immediately. His heart raced and his grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? He asked, his voice trembling slightly. The voice on the other end chuckled softly, a chilling sound. Someone who knows that some secrets are better left buried. You're dealing with forces that have been in control for decades. Walk away now, and this can all go away. Keep going, and you won't like where this leads. The line went dead. The warning wasn't a surprise. Paul and Linda had expected something like this, but the fact that it was happening now, when they were so close to the truth, made it all the more terrifying. The question was no longer whether Orellano was a forgotten town. It was whether the people who controlled its secrets would allow anyone to bring it to light. Over the next few days, Paul noticed that things had started to change. He began seeing unfamiliar cars parked near his apartment. Strangers walked by, glancing over their shoulders. The feeling of being watched grew unbearable. It was clear someone was keeping an eye on them, someone who didn't want them to find the truth. Linda, too, felt the pressure mounting. One night, as she was driving home, she noticed a familiar figure in her rearview mirror. A black sedan had been following her for miles. She tried to shake it off, taking unexpected turns, driving through alleyways, but the car kept pace, always a few yards behind her. In a moment of desperation, Linda sped up, taking a sharp turn onto a side street. The sedan did the same, its headlights flashing brightly in her mirror. Panic surged through her as she realized there was no escaping. She pushed the gas pedal to the floor, but the car kept coming. At the last minute, she swerved sharply into a gas station parking lot, slamming on the brakes. The black sedan passed by without stopping, but the message was clear. Whoever they were, they had been watching, waiting, and they were willing to do whatever it took to make sure Linda and Paul didn't uncover Orellano's secrets. That night, both Paul and Linda met at their usual place, the quiet diner in the corner of Rio Blanco. The diner was familiar, a place they could go without worrying about being watched. But even there, the sense of unease followed them. As they sat in their booth, their conversation was low, almost whispered. "I don't think we're safe anymore," Linda said, her voice tinged with fear. "They know we're getting close. They're trying to scare us off." Paul looked over his shoulder, scanning the diner, half expecting someone to be watching them. "They've been following me too," he said, his voice grim. "I think we're too close to the truth, and someone, somewhere, doesn't want us to find it." Their fear was not unfounded. The more they dug, the more their lives began to unravel. They started receiving anonymous messages warning them to stay away from Orellano. Strange phone calls, unexplained occurrences, each one seemed to confirm their worst fears. They were being watched, and the people who were watching them weren't interested in letting them get any closer to the truth. But the deeper they went, the more they uncovered about Orellano, and the more they realized just how dangerous their investigation had become. They had stumbled upon something that went far beyond a forgotten town. Orellano wasn't just a town that had been erased. It was a key to something bigger, something the government had worked hard to conceal. The truth was darker than they had ever imagined. Orellano had been a testing ground, not just for mind control, but for something much worse. The experiments conducted there had been designed to break the human spirit, to push the boundaries of human endurance. And the people who had lived there were not just casualties of the experiment, they were its unwilling participants. As Paul and Linda continued to investigate, they uncovered more about the experiments that had taken place in Orellano. The government had tested everything, from mind control to extreme psychological conditioning. The townspeople, selected for their vulnerabilities, had been used as pawns in a grand, twisted experiment. But what the government had not anticipated was the power of the land itself. The underground minerals that had made the town so valuable had a strange, almost supernatural effect on those who lived there. They enhanced the effects of the psychological experiments, making the subjects more susceptible to control, more prone to mental breakdowns, and ultimately more malleable. And as Paul and Linda pieced together the puzzle, one chilling truth became clear. Orellano had been a place where the very fabric of the human mind had been torn apart and rebuilt. And those who had survived the experiments, if there were any survivors, had been left to live in a world where their memories, their very sense of reality, had been shattered. But the danger was far from over. As Paul and Linda began to piece together the final details of their investigation, they realized that they weren't just uncovering the truth about Orellano, but they were uncovering a secret that threatened to unravel everything. The government had been hiding something much darker than anyone could have imagined. And now the people behind the cover-up were desperate to ensure that the truth would never be revealed. The warning had been clear. Every step Paul and Linda took toward uncovering the truth about Orellano had drawn them deeper into a web of secrecy, surveillance, and danger. They had seen what the government was willing to do to keep its darkest secrets hidden. But the deeper they dug, the more they realized the truth was not just buried, it was being actively protected. The stakes had never been higher. As the days dragged on, the weight of their discovery became suffocating. They had uncovered the truth about Orellano, the mind control experiments, the hidden history of the town, the people whose lives had been manipulated for the sake of a twisted scientific agenda. But they knew they couldn't stop there. The government had gone to extreme lengths to hide the town's existence, to erase the people of Orellano from history. And now, as Paul and Linda were closing in on the final pieces of the puzzle, they felt the suffocating pressure of being watched, hunted by forces far more powerful than they could have ever anticipated. It was on a cold evening in late September when Paul received an unexpected visitor. He had been working late, as usual, going through the last of the government files they had uncovered. The doorbell rang, shattering the silence of the room. He opened the door cautiously, his mind already racing with the possibilities of who it could be. It was Linda, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. She told me to stop digging. They told me that if we keep going, we won't just lose our lives, we'll lose everything we know. The weight of Linda's words hit Paul like a punch. They had already been threatened, watched, and warned, but this felt different. This felt like a warning from someone inside the very system they were investigating. They had uncovered the darkest corners of Orellano's story, and now it seemed like the powers that be were preparing to strike back. "What do we do now?" Paul asked, his voice tight with fear and frustration. He had known from the beginning that there was something dangerous about this investigation, but now he understood the full scope of the risk. Linda shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't know, but if we don't finish this now, if we don't expose the truth, then everything we've done will be for nothing. Orellano, those people, they deserve to be remembered. We owe it to them to finish what we started." There was no turning back now. Paul and Linda knew the risks, but they also knew they couldn't let the truth be buried any longer. They had come too far to turn away. But as they began to prepare for the final leg of their investigation, the threats escalated. The mysterious black sedan, the shadowy figures following them, the constant sense of being watched, it was all part of the same web. Every day, they grew more paranoid, more aware that someone was always close, always monitoring their every move. But even as they felt the pressure mounting, they pressed forward. They knew that, whatever the consequences, they had to expose Orellano. In the following days, Paul and Linda began to piece together the final details. They uncovered more about the experiments that had taken place in Orellano, revealing shocking truths about the extent of the government's manipulation. The experiments had been designed to push human beings to their limits, mentally, physically, and emotionally. The residents of Orellano had been subjected to intense psychological conditioning, designed to break their will and rebuild it according to the government's whims. The final piece of the puzzle came when they uncovered a classified document from the 1940s, hidden deep in the government archives. It contained a chilling admission. The experiment has yielded unexpected results. The subject's susceptibility to external control has increased beyond our expectations. The land's unique properties seem to have a profound effect on the human psyche, and it has amplified the success of the program. The document went on to explain that the government had been conducting similar experiments in other towns, but none had yielded results as potent as Orellano. The residents of the town had become perfect subjects, easily controlled, easily manipulated, without their knowledge. The truth was terrifying. Orellano had been part of a nationwide operation to create a population of people who could be controlled at will. As Paul and Linda read the document, the full scope of the government's plans began to unfold. They had been playing with the minds of innocent people, testing the limits of human control. Orellano had been a test subject, a town of human guinea pigs who had been subjected to psychological manipulation on an unprecedented scale. And now, it seemed that those responsible were willing to do anything to keep it all hidden. On the night before they were set to expose their findings, Linda received another call. This time, it wasn't a warning. It was a threat. The voice on the other end was cold, calm, and unmistakable. "You're about to make a huge mistake," the voice said. "You're digging up things that should stay buried. If you go through with this, there will be no place for you to hide. We will make sure of that." The line went dead. The threats were real, and they weren't just empty words. As Paul and Linda sat in their apartment that night, the weight of everything they had uncovered settled heavily on them. The government wasn't just trying to stop them, they were preparing to silence them for good. But they couldn't stop now. They had uncovered the truth, and the world needed to know. Orellano couldn't be erased any longer. The people who had suffered there, the lives that had been manipulated, deserved justice. The next morning, Paul and Linda uploaded their findings, everything they had uncovered about Orellano, on a secure, anonymous platform. They knew it would be their only chance to get the truth out. Within minutes, the file had been downloaded by countless people, spreading the news of Orellano to the far corners of the world. And then just as quickly, the website was taken down. The truth had been exposed, but the fight was far from over. The authorities acted fast, but the truth had already been seeded. The world now knew about Orellano, and there would be no easy way to erase it. But for Paul and Linda, the consequences were clear. Their investigation had taken them to the brink of something much bigger than they had ever imagined. And as they watched their lives unravel before them, they understood one thing: the fight for the truth was far from over. Maybe some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Maybe some secrets are buried too deep, and those who seek them out will pay the price. But Orellano will never be forgotten. The town may have been erased from the maps, but its story will live on, a testament to the dangers of control and manipulation. As the story of Orellano reaches its end, one question remains. What really happened there? Were the people who lived in the town victims of a twisted experiment, or was there something more at play? The truth may never be fully uncovered, but one thing is certain. The story of Orellano will haunt the world for generations to come.